So, thanks for coming. Today I'm going to be talking about not my own research, but rather a review that we put out earlier this year on how animal behaviour can help inform marine conservation. Sorry, Vice Chair said it didn't work. So, in thinking about the ocean, how we value it, the ocean is obviously full of a range of different biodiverse and biologically unique ecosystems, ranging from shallow tropical seas to deep sea ocean vents. And there's a range of different ways that we can value the ocean. So obviously it has an intrinsic natural value to us. It also has a high cultural importance to a range of different people around the world. Many of the world's population live very close to the ocean. And it's also a very important economic asset. So it was recently valued at $24 trillion US annually. So it's a really huge amount of money. And this comes from a range of different industries, including fisheries, tourism, and various different trades. And we all know that the ocean is, and a range of different sort of marine ecosystems are in decline globally. And this is due to sustained overexploitation and degradation. And this comes from a range of different sources, including fisheries, pollution, and the effects of climate change. In the worst case scenarios, this can lead to ecosystem collapses and environmental dead zones. And even when we don't see that little extreme sort of effect, overall we see a loss of ecosystem services when habitats decline. So to counteract this, we're seeing an increase in the amount of conservation and management of the ocean that we've seen. So we have a variety of different tools and legal frameworks available to us to protect ocean biodiversity. And two of the common ones are protecting areas of the ocean legally, and also how we manage fisheries. The greater sort of awareness of the ocean and its problems has led to a greater investment in marine conservation, and we have seen a few success stories, but overall we're seeing a sustained biodiversity decline overall in the ocean. So how does animal behaviour fit into marine conservation? Well, the way animals behave and their decision making affect a range of different important processes, including how they move and use space, how they feed and what they feed on, how they organise themselves socially, and how they reproduce. We think about how conservation, the fields of conservation, biology, and animal behaviour fit together. There's a range of different three main themes: how our actions are affecting the behaviour of animals, how we can use animal behaviour to indicate how habitats are declining, and using animal behaviour to base our management decisions around. Basically, we want to use the natural tendencies of the animals to do certain things, help manage the ocean to increase its resilience and promote its recovery. So in this talk I'm going to talk about sort of 4 key areas where insights from animal behaviour could help us to improve the effectiveness of conservation efforts. And just for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to focus on conservation of tropical fishes and fisheries in general. So there's 4 areas I'm going to talk about: how larval behaviour can help us understand connectivity, how behavioural flexibility can help us to minimise biodiversity losses, how behavioural variation can be incorporated into conservation and management actions, and finally how physiological drivers of animal behaviour can help us manage climate threats. So moving on to larval behaviour. So understanding how animals disperse and settle in the ocean is of central importance for conservation biology. In the ocean, many animals have a planktonic larval dispersal stage, allowing them to potentially move over very big distances. This has important conservation implications. So in the ocean we may see seemingly allopatric populations, but they may in fact be connected. So we have to understand that. So we need to understand how they're connected, and there's a range of different ways that we can find this out using a bit of population theory, theories like recruitment hotspots, and also understanding how the larvae themselves are behaviourally affecting where they go. So many marine larvae have a very well-developed sense of sensory system, ability to move around, And this allows them to seek out habitats that wouldn't be available if dispersal was solely a function of the ocean currents and other hydrodynamic events. And we see this high level of competency in both invertebrate and vertebrate larvae, in both tropical and temperate systems. And these sort of sensory systems are important over a range of geographic scales. So they can help larvae to find a reef or help them to find a certain microhabitat within that reef system. And larvae use a range of different sensory cues that are available to them to orientate, including chemicals, sounds, currents, magnetic and celestial fields, visual and polarized light, chemical gradients, and electrical fields. So we need to understand the sources of these cues that they're using and how we can establish the scale over which they are behaviourally relevant. So there's been a lot of work in this area. Given the really good chemosensory and auditory systems of coral reef larvae, there's been a lot of work on those two sort of areas. And this work has shown us that coral reef larvae are able to, so fishes and things like that, are able to distinguish between healthy and degraded systems based on these cues. So for instance, olfactory cues, so odours, they can use terrestrial inputs, so pollution and things like that. They don't like these sort of degraded reefs that are turned to algae based on their odour. In terms of auditory cues, we get weaker sounds from reefs that are degraded, and things like boat noise can reduce recruitment and lead to increased mortality. We have a very big effect on the sensory environment in the ocean. We don't really consider it, but increased coastal development and how we use the land near the ocean is affecting this sort of oceanic sensory environment for these animals. And so even though we think about pollution and things like that, the full consequences of our actions that are linked to the marine environment may be overlooked. So we really need to understand our impact on the sensory environment and take action to reduce negative cues that are entering the system and promote those positive cues. If we do this, we may have an avenue to increase recruitment to these systems, which would promote resilience or lead to restoration of these damaged systems. So how do we improve the sensory environment? Modifying our current practices based on our current knowledge of how these animals use chemical, odor cues, things like that, could reinforce or promote larval sediment. So there's a range of different ways to do this. So for instance, controlling pollution, how we use sort of agricultural land even far away from the ocean may be affecting the cues that are coming into these systems. So like changing agricultural practices, incorporating this sort of ideas into coastal development. So coastal vegetation appears really important for fishes. So changing that to different agricultural crops might have an effect. We can sort of do things like land sharing, where we sort of split up agricultural systems with native plants that might have an effect. In terms of sensory, auditory cues, minimising boat traffic during recruitment in areas of conservation concern might be important. But there's a range of other, so I've talked about olfactory and auditory cues, but other cues are also important. So things like having a lot of light pollution on the ocean at night could be affecting how larvae find these homes or drawing them to areas that they don't want to be. So now I'm going to move on to my second area, which is how behavioural flexibility and vulnerability to habitat degradation and minimising biodiversity loss. So how animals use resources within their environment is often the result of active behavioural decisions. And animals exist along those sort of axes from specialists to generalists. Specialists select a limited range of items from those available, and generalists have greater selective flexibility. So being specialised has certain trade-offs. You have adaptations so you can better use the resources that you select, but you have a smaller resource base that you can draw from. So given that smaller resource base, specialists are disadvantaged if those preferred resources become scarce. And if they can't modify their behaviour to compensate for that loss, then they face local extinction or worse. So one of the primary goals of conservation biology is to preserve biodiversity. So given that there's a few key considerations in terms of specialists, for instance, what is driving specialisation, how specialists interact with their environment, how declines in resource availability will affect behaviour. How do we assess vulnerability? So these specialised animals often have important ecological or socio-economic roles. For instance, these trapeze crabs protect their corals from crown of thorns, herbivores remove algae, and cleaner-race increase biodiversity. However, our assessment of how vulnerable these species are to changing environmental conditions is limited due to our limited understanding of what the animals are using and how flexible they are, either at the individual, population, or species level. And an example of this is the coral-associated fishes. So the more we look at this group of animals, we've seen that many appear to be really much more specialised than we originally thought. So instead of just they need corals, they might need just one type of coral, acropora, or one species of acropora. So, and how specialised they are in terms of what corals they use seems to correlate with their extinction risk. So I'm hearing reports from lizard that these gobiodon, the little gobies in the middle, there used to be sort of 7 or 8 species of lizard, now there's sort of 1. So it's not looking good, but so in terms of how we deal with that, it's difficult in practice, but I think including more information in our sort of assessment of reefs. So when you survey a coral reef, include coral species if you can, and how increase our sort of level of understanding of how these different corals are susceptible to disturbances. So because these animals are so reliant on those corals, understanding the corals is a good way to understand these species' vulnerability. How at risk these animals are is also dependent on behavioural flexibility. So often when we look at these animals in one population, they look really specialised. So we go to lizard, these butterfly fish might just be eating one species of acropora, say acropora hyacinthus. But when we look at the patterns of resource use over larger scales, we see that they appear to be much more flexible. So different populations are feeding on different things wherever you go. Some of them may not even be feeding on corals. So given that there's a limited amount of resources available for prioritised conservation, having a good solid estimate of how different animals are vulnerable is really important. So I've discussed how many of these sort of things like corals and things like that, they're important habitat for a lot of animals, and a lot of them are really specialised to specific habitat engineers. So in different systems as well, these sort of living structures are really important as habitat. So in, say, kelp forest or in deep sea sort of sponge reef, that habitat is created by living animals. And often these habitat engineers are also on their own also very specialised and so very vulnerable to changing conditions. So we can see that the composition of these habitats changes as conditions change, and so we may see that these sort of biodiversity declines in associated animals, even though we see these only subtle changes in the composition of these benthic habitats. So I mean, it's pretty standard stuff here. Like in terms of management, we should be looking at how to preserve habitat composition or facilitate its creation to help biodiversity recovery. And so a good area in terms of how to create new habitat is during the design of coastal infrastructure, say wind farms, oil rigs, things like that. So many studies have shown that simply just by incorporating, taking into account and incorporating factors such as slope angle or habitat complexity into these structures, we can have big effects on the local biodiversity. So things like that are really important for the future, I think. Also, I think we need to target conservation for certain animals that are particularly important. So Some animals have a disproportionate effect on the surrounding biodiversity of their environment. For instance, herbivores, there's quite a number of fish that are herbivorous on reefs, but only certain ones appear to be able to, or the seaweeds that have or pose the most risk to these sort of reefs that are undergoing phase shifts. So there needs to be targeted conservation to protect these certain species. And I know from my own experience in Fiji, we had a lot of success with community education, so really teaching the people not to target certain species of herbivores from that community that's on their home reefs. And there's other things as well, like expanding NPAs as well to protect these certain species. Another example is plenarace. So plenarace are really important for increasing the biodiversity of reefs or their local environment. And when we see these plenarace being removed, we see declines in the diversity, abundance, recruitment of the associated fish communities. Plenarace are really important ornamental species in the aquarium trade. So I think an important way to protect that biodiversity would be to reduce the pressure on wild stocks of plenarace. So if you're going to start up an ornamental aquaculture industry, maybe work on doing that. Moving on to staying on the same theme of behavioural variation, we're going to look at how that could affect, could be incorporated into resource conservation and fisheries management. So, as I mentioned, in these sort of populations, there's quite a lot of, in these sort of species, how at risk they are depends on how much variation we see. And within these populations, we can see a lot of variation in how they respond to changing conditions. So having this variable behavioural responses can increase that population's overall adaptability and ability to persist under conditions. Having a spectrum of different behavioural phenotypes within a population is really important. It allows the population to better cope with future selective pressures. And so determining that variability within populations and taking measures to preserve it is an important conservation tool. So, a bit more about theories. Hello?
Sorry. Yeah. You know what? I think they know. Yeah. Good. To win.
So a bit more about behavioural phenotypes. Evolutionary change happens faster in seems to happen faster in populations with a larger variation in their behavioural phenotypes available. So reducing that variation increases that population's vulnerability to changes and limits its recovery potential. Unfortunately, sort of selective pressures that are limiting that variation are already occurring in exploited populations, so fisheries. So the impacts of fishing, many sort of fisheries target the largest individuals, and this can bias populations towards groups that have slow growth, early maturation phenotypes. So those ones that are removed, those fast growth phenotypes are more active, often more active, bold, aggressive, and so they're more vulnerable to fishing methods that use passive gear such as hooks and things like that. And an example of that is in bass. So the bass that are more likely to be caught are more aggressive. They also have greater territorial care and have better reproductive fitness. So removing those is not a good thing. And so this sort of trend for large, fast type phenotypes is true for both commercial, recreational and commercial fishing. So one way to deal with that would be to maybe change fishing policy, and some of this stuff is obviously already occurring. So putting in policies that account for behavioural variation and diversity could help to ensure that populations are able to persist and ensure that, or preserve that ongoing viability. For instance, we could impose maximum and minimum size catch restrictions. I know a lot of fisheries already do that. Remove incentives for catching large individuals, so these sort of trophy fishing tournaments where bigger is better might sort of not be the best thing to do. Even those catch and release ones where the fish inevitably dies, it's not great. And maybe move fisheries to target species that have short lifespans, both in commercial and recreational fishing. And doing this might allow persistence of a greater range of personality types and the less biased removal of those types from those populations. Now, as the exploitation of marine stocks is increasing and increasing, reproduction and stock enhancement programs are going to be increasingly important. Though the number of hatchery red fish has grown, those populations that they're releasing that into, we're seeing continued declines of spawning biomass. And one of the reasons for why this could be occurring is that production techniques of these hatchery fishes aren't taking into account the preparation for those wild environments. So released fish in general have reduced growth and survival, plus they're bolder and less experienced with predators, so they're more likely to die. And they have a limited ability to recognise and capture wild prey, so they might not be feeding as well, leading to reduced fitness, things like that. So how do we reduce the mortality rate in these sort of hatchery red fish? One way to do it would be through behavioural training, and there's been some successes in this area, especially most of it's just in sort of research conditions. For example, juvenile Atlantic salmon that have been reared in enriched conditions, less bold, have improved learning abilities, and show greater foraging rates on novel prey than non-enriched individuals. However, they still lag behind those ones that have been caught from the wild. So we still need to refine these techniques further. How do we do that? One way would be to expose these individuals to conspecifics that exhibit a desired behavioural trait that you want. Many fishes can rapidly acquire the ability to complete novel tasks, such as feeding on a novel species or food type or something like that, or have greater anti-predator skills through social learning. So we can modify the methods that we use to improve the rates that we use to teach these hatchery red larvae to improve the rates of critical information retention in the stock. And there's a range of different ways we can do that. For instance, increasing conditioning strength, reducing time between conditioning and release, reducing food supply prior to release, multiple predator cues, conditioning in appropriate habitats, or maintaining the social networks that were in captivity when we release them into the wild. So finally, we're going to look at how the physiological, the outside environment affects animal behaviour and how this could impact stocks following climate threats. So in addition to things like habitat use, fisheries, selectivity, things like that, conservation efforts should also consider the external and internal stresses that can influence animals' behaviour. And subtle changes in the external environment, for instance water chemistry or changes in temperature, can cause quite large physiological and behavioural changes in the animal. And these effects can lead to reduced fitness and abundance in these stocks, even when the habitat looks otherwise healthy. So understanding the behavioural strategies that animals use to alleviate physiological stress can give us a strong theoretical and practical foundation for effective conservation. So many marine animals are ectotherms, so their capacity for physical and physiological performance is directly related to the ambient water temperature. So rising temperatures are going to increase the energetic costs of activity, growth, reproduction, things like that. An example, the expected temperature increases that over the next 100 years could lead up to a sort of 40% increase in the metabolic maintenance cost in marine fishes. And this is going to have the most effect on species that travel vast distances to spawn or require huge home ranges, things like that. Need to move around a lot, so they'll be particularly vulnerable. So this hawk fish is probably going to be okay. So temperature, in terms of one of those main sort of areas where it's going to affect fishes, is during their spawning periods. So temperature is really important for spawning and initiating that spawning sort of cycle. So changes to the onset or conclusion of the breeding season is going to be altered for many species. And so we're going to see reproduction that is limited to those thermal windows and photo periods during early spring and summer, and they may shift from when they are occurring now. So species that have big distributions and differential, we often see differential onset of courtship, spawning and migratory behaviours in these sort of big area species. So they may benefit from staggering of fishing closures. So often we see, people, they close fisheries when the spawning is occurring, so we may need to change that so that it's staggered across these large distributions. The other area where temperature is going to be really important is how animals move. So this slide is more about how it's affecting animals now, and we can take this into account. But as conditions change, incorporating behavioural mitigation patterns in animals is going to be increasingly important. So how animals move around to move into favourable habitats. And some fishes actively search for habitats with water temperatures that are optimised for their performance, and they avoid areas that promote metabolic depression. So my example for this is Atlantic sturgeon. So some work at the University of Delaware has shown that these fishes will move around the Atlantic coast based on the ambient water temperatures, so differences in that water masses along that coastline, they'll move amongst it. These fishes are really endangered, and they're a big bycatch species. So it's not good for these fish when they get caught, but it's also not good for the fishermen, because when they get caught as bycatch, that affects their remaining quota. So finding out ways to stop these fish from being caught is really important. And so I haven't done it, but they've looked at where they are, and they can sort of look at a map and from different temperature, from satellites and things, work out where the fish are, tell the fishermen to move out of that area for that one day when that water mass is expanded, and they can go back in the next day. And it seems to be working really well. So conservation efforts should consider both the current conditions, current temperature conditions, but also the future. So in the future, we're expecting to see big changes in water temperatures, and we may, if these environmental conditions become physiologically incompatible with the biology of the animals that are living there, they may force species to relocate. They can't do that, they may face local extinction. So insights into the physiologically driven behavioural changes that these animals are doing can help us to formulate effective management strategies and help to prepare industry for expected changes. So for instance, prior to investing a lot of infrastructure into fisheries, we can determine whether a stock is going to be there in 30 to 50 years or it's going to be somewhere else. And also reducing the severity of ongoing changes through increased protection of sensitive habitats, both now and where we predict them to be, and catch regulations that reduce those impacts. So just to conclude, incorporating knowledge from behavioural ecology into conservation initiatives could increase the effectiveness of these programs at stemming the biodiversity losses and promoting recovery. And these can be both in sort of conservation management and also in fisheries management and sort of industry. And they can both have positive effects on conservation. Conservation behaviour is a relatively new field, but incorporating elements from behavioural ecology is really important, as it's a sort of intuitively complementary field. So the continued intertwining of these two sort of different disparate sort of fields will probably have parallel benefits for both. So as I mentioned, this is a review that this talk was based on a review that we just put out this year. That's the, send me an email if you want that reference. And any questions?